The Apache girl's words cut through the desert air like a blade. I can't live without a man. But when rancher Elias Ward found her broken body in the dust, whipped and left to die by her own tribe, he faced an impossible choice: save her and become an enemy of the Apache nation, or let her perish and live with blood on his hands. What happened next would ignite a firestorm that would test the boundaries of honor, survival, and forbidden love in the unforgiving American frontier. Stay with me until the very end of this tale and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories of the Wild West can travel across our modern world. The sun had been a merciless tyrant over the New Mexico territory for 3 straight weeks, baking the earth until it cracked like broken pottery and turning every breath into a furnace blast that seared the lungs. Elias Ward pulled his worn hat lower over his weathered face as he guided his horse along the ridge that overlooked his ranch. If you could still call the collection of sun-bleached buildings and withered pastures a ranch. The drought had claimed most of his cattle, and what remained of his life seemed as barren as the landscape stretching endlessly toward the purple mountains on the horizon. At 42, Elias had the kind of face that told stories without words, deep lines carved by years of squinting into desert winds, a jaw set permanently in resignation, and eyes the color of storm clouds that had seen too much loss. His hands, rough as rawhide and strong as iron, gripped the reins with the unconscious competence of a man who had spent half his life in the saddle. Those same hands had once held his wife's gentle fingers and tousled his daughter's golden hair. Now they held only leather and loneliness. The ranch had been their dream, his Martha's and little Sarah's. They'd come west from Missouri with hearts full of hope and pockets full of determination, ready to carve a life from the wilderness. Martha had planted flowers by the front porch and hung curtains in the windows, making the rough cabin feel like home. Sarah had chased chickens around the yard and begged him for a pony every single day. For 3 perfect years they had built something beautiful together. Then the fever came. It swept through the territory like wildfire, claiming the weak and the strong alike. Martha fought it for 2 weeks, her body burning with heat, while Elias bathed her with cool water and whispered desperate prayers to a God who seemed to have turned his face away. Sarah lasted only 4 days, her small body unable to fight what had already claimed her mother. In the span of a month, Elias went from being a husband and father to being a man alone with nothing but graves on the hillside and memories that cut deeper than any knife. That was 5 years ago. 5 years of going through the motions of living without really being alive. 5 years of talking to ghosts and working himself to exhaustion just to fall into dreamless sleep. 5 years of watching the ranch slowly die around him, as if the land itself mourned the loss of the laughter that had once filled these empty spaces. Now, as he rode the perimeter checking for breaks in his fencing, what little remained intact, Elias found himself wondering why he bothered. The bank would probably foreclose before winter anyway. Maybe it was time to accept that some dreams were meant to die with the people who shared them. His horse, an aging mare named Duchess, who had been Sarah's favorite, suddenly lifted her head and snorted nervously. Her ears swiveled forward, focused on something beyond the next rise. Elias felt the familiar prickle of alertness that had kept him alive through the war and everything that came after. Out here in the vast emptiness between settlements, being alert wasn't just prudent, it was survival. "What is it, girl?" he murmured, running a calming hand along Duchess's neck. The mare's muscles were tense beneath his palm, her entire body rigid with whatever had caught her attention. As they crested the small hill, Elias saw what had spooked his horse, and his blood turned to ice in his veins. A figure lay motionless in the sand about 50 yards ahead, dark hair spread like spilled ink against the pale earth. Even from this distance he could see the unnatural stillness that spoke of either death or something very close to it. But what made his heart hammer against his ribs wasn't just the sight of another human being in this desolate place. It was the unmistakable style of the clothes, the cut of the hair, the bronze tone of the skin visible even under a coating of dust and blood. Apache. Elias's hand moved instinctively to the Winchester rifle in his saddle scabbard. The Apache had been quiet lately. No raids, no attacks on settlements or travelers. But that didn't mean they were gone, and it certainly didn't mean they were friendly. The wars between the Apache tribes and the white settlers had left scars on both sides that ran deeper than any canyon painted in blood and watered with tears that would take generations to dry. He should ride away. That was the smart thing to do. The safe thing. Whatever had happened to that figure in the sand wasn't his problem, and getting involved with Apache business was a sure way to end up joining Martha and Sarah on the hillside behind his cabin. The territorial authorities had made it clear Apache matters were Apache matters, and white folks who stuck their noses where they didn't belong often found themselves without noses or heads to worry about. But as Duchess shifted nervously beneath him, Elias found himself studying the figure more closely. There was something wrong with the picture, something that didn't fit with his assumptions about Apache warriors or war parties. The person wasn't moving at all, not even the shallow breathing of unconsciousness. And there were no horses, no weapons visible, no signs of a camp or a struggle. Just a lone figure apparently abandoned in the middle of nowhere to die under the killing sun. "Damn it," Elias muttered, and he meant it in every sense of the word. Because despite every instinct screaming at him to turn around and ride home, despite every lesson learned in blood and loss, despite the logical voice in his head telling him that heroes died young and died alone, he couldn't just leave another human being to die in the desert heat. Maybe it was because he knew what it felt like to be alone. Maybe it was because Martha had always said that a man's character was measured not by what he did when people were watching, but by what he did when nobody would ever know. Or maybe it was simply because he was tired of death, winning every single hand in the game of life. He urged Duchess forward, rifle ready, but not raised, every sense alert for signs of an ambush. As they drew closer, details became clearer, and what he saw made his stomach clench with a mixture of rage and pity that surprised him with its intensity. The figure was a woman young, probably no more than 25, with the fine bone structure and proud bearing that marked her as Apache nobility even in her current state. But it was her condition that made Elias's jaw clench and his hands tighten on the reins. Her buckskin dress was torn and stained with blood, and across her back he could see the distinctive marks of a whipping long, cruel welts that had been left to fester in the heat. Her face was swollen from blows, her lips cracked and bleeding from dehydration, and her hands were bound behind her back with rawhide thongs that had cut deep into her wrists. Someone had beaten this woman within an inch of her life and then left her here to die slowly under the merciless sun. Elias dismounted slowly, his boots crunching softly in the sand as he approached. The woman didn't move, and for a moment he thought he was too late, that whatever mercy he might have offered was already beyond giving. But then he saw the almost imperceptible rise and fall of her chest, the slight flutter of her eyelids that spoke of life clinging by the thinnest of threads. "Ma'am," he called softly, not wanting to startle her if she was conscious. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyes snapped open like a trap springing, and even through the swelling and bruising, Elias found himself looking into the most extraordinary eyes he had ever seen, dark as obsidian but flecked with gold like stars scattered across a midnight sky. They held pain and defiance in equal measure, and something else that took him a moment to recognize, surprise that anyone had found her at all. She tried to speak, but only a harsh croak emerged from her parched throat. Elias quickly pulled his canteen from his belt and knelt beside her, supporting her head gently as he trickled water between her cracked lips. She drank greedily, desperately, and he could see the life flowing back into her with each swallow. "Easy," he murmured, using the same tone he had once used to calm frightened horses or comfort his daughter after a nightmare. "Easy now, you're safe." She pulled back from the canteen and studied his face, with those remarkable eyes, taking in his weathered features, his gentle hands, the concern written plainly across his expression. When she spoke, her voice was like sandpaper, raw and painful, but understandable. "Why?" she asked in English, and the single word contained multitudes. Why had he stopped? Why was he helping her? Why was he risking himself for a stranger? Why was he showing kindness when her own people had shown her only cruelty? Elias met her gaze steadily, seeing the intelligence behind the pain, the strength that even brutal treatment hadn't been able to break. "Because leaving you here would make me less than human," he said simply. "And I've lost enough of my humanity already." Something shifted in her expression. A flicker of understanding, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit who knew what it meant to carry wounds that went deeper than flesh. She nodded slightly, and Elias took it as permission to help her sit up. The movement sent waves of obvious pain through her body, but she gritted her teeth and endured it without complaint. Elias could see the full extent of her injuries, now the whip marks across her back and shoulders, the rope burns on her wrists, the bruises that spoke of fists and feet used with deliberate cruelty. Someone had wanted her to suffer before she died. "Who did this to you?" he asked, already knowing he probably wouldn't get an answer. Apache business was Apache business, and white men who asked too many questions usually found themselves with more trouble than they could handle. But to his surprise, she answered. "My people," she said, and the bitterness in her voice could have etched glass. "My own people." Elias felt his eyebrows raise. He knew enough about Apache culture to understand that they took care of their own, especially their women. For them to do this to one of their own, she would have had to commit some unforgivable transgression. "What did you do?" he asked gently. Her laugh was harsh as a crow's call. "I failed to give my husband sons. I failed to be the woman they needed me to be. And when I spoke against my punishment..." She gestured weakly at her battered body. "This..." The casual cruelty of it hit Elias like a physical blow. He had seen enough violence in his life, in the war on the frontier, in the endless cycles of revenge and retribution that seemed to define life in the territory. But there was something particularly devastating about the idea of being cast out by your own people, rejected by the very community that was supposed to protect and nurture you. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated for a moment, and he could see her weighing whether to trust him with even that small piece of herself. Finally, she spoke. "Takina. It means one who runs ahead." "I'm Elias," he replied. "Elias Ward, and right now, Takina, you've got a choice to make." He gestured toward the vast emptiness surrounding them. "I can leave you here with water and food, give you a fighting chance to make it to wherever you're trying to go. Or..." He paused, hardly believing what he was about to offer. "You can come with me, back to my ranch. It's not much, but it's shelter, and you'll have time to heal." Takina studied his face for a long moment, those extraordinary eyes seeming to look straight through to his soul. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "You know what I am. You know the danger." Elias thought about Martha's grave on the hillside, about Sarah's empty room, about the 5 years he had spent existing rather than living. "Maybe," he said slowly, "because helping someone else heal might help me remember what it feels like to be human again." She continued to stare at him, and he could see the internal battle playing out behind her eyes. The instinct to trust warring with years of betrayal and pain, the desire for safety fighting against the knowledge that accepting help from him would change both their lives irrevocably. "If I come with you," she said finally, "they will see it as choosing your people over mine. There will be consequences." "There are always consequences," Elias replied. "The question is whether you're willing to face them for a chance at something better than dying alone in the sand." For another long moment the only sound was the whisper of wind across the desert and the soft stamping of Duchess's hooves. Then Takina nodded just once, and Elias felt something shift in the universe. A door opening, a path changing, a story beginning that would alter the course of both their lives. Getting her onto the horse was a careful, painful process. Her injuries made every movement agony, and Elias found himself cursing whoever had done this to her with a vehemence that surprised him. But Takina endured it all without complaint. Her jaw set in determination that reminded him of Martha, facing down the fever that would eventually claim her fierce pride, refusing to surrender even when the odds were impossible. The ride back to the ranch was slow and careful, with Elias walking alongside Duchess to ensure Takina didn't fall. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded him of better times when he had shared such sunsets with his family. Now he found himself sharing one with a woman who should have been his enemy, whose presence in his life would almost certainly bring trouble he wasn't prepared to handle. But as they approached the familiar outline of his ranch buildings, the cabin Martha had made into a home, the barn where Sarah had played with kittens, the corrals that had once held horses and cattle and dreams, Elias realized that for the first time in 5 years, he didn't feel completely alone. The cabin looked smaller than he remembered as they drew near, its adobe walls weathered by sun and wind, its wooden porch sagging slightly where he hadn't gotten around to fixing it. The flower beds Martha had planted were long dead, choked with weeds and neglect. The whole place had the air of a life half-lived, of dreams deferred and hopes abandoned. Takina said nothing as he helped her down from the horse, but he could see her taking in every detail, the isolation, the signs of decay, the overwhelming sense of emptiness that seemed to permeate everything. If she was judging him for letting his life fall apart, she kept her opinions to herself. The interior of the cabin was worse than the outside. Elias realized, seeing it through a stranger's eyes, just how far he had let things slide. Dust covered every surface, dishes sat unwashed in the basin, and clothes were scattered wherever he had dropped them. The only clean areas were Martha's sewing corner and Sarah's small bedroom spaces he couldn't bear to disturb, but also couldn't bring himself to really maintain. "I'm sorry," he said, suddenly embarrassed by the state of his home. "I don't usually have visitors." Takina's response surprised him. "A house without women becomes a shell," she said softly. "I have seen this before." There was something in her tone that told him she understood loss, understood what it meant to have the heart torn out of a place that had once been filled with love. It was an unexpected moment of connection, a bridge built from shared sorrow. He settled her on the old sofa that Martha had insisted on bringing from Missouri, the same sofa where Sarah had curled up for bedtime stories and where he and Martha had planned their future together. Now it held an Apache woman who had been beaten and cast out by her own people, and somehow that felt right in a way he couldn't quite explain. "I need to tend your wounds," he said, gathering what medical supplies he had, mostly items left over from when the ranch had employed Cowboy's bandages and salve and a bottle of whiskey that would serve as disinfectant. "This is going to hurt." Takina's smile was grim but genuine. "Pain and I are old friends," she said. "We understand each other well." As Elias carefully cleaned and dressed her wounds, he found himself studying her face in the lamplight. Even battered and exhausted, she was beautiful, in a way that had nothing to do with conventional prettiness and everything to do with strength of character. There was something indomitable about her, a core of steel that all the beatings in the world couldn't bend. "Tell me about your husband," he said, as he worked partly to distract her from the pain and partly because he found himself genuinely curious about the man who had let his people do this to her. Her expression darkened. "He was weak," she said simply. "Strong in body, but weak in spirit. When I bore no children after 3 years, he listened to the whispers that said I was cursed, that I was bringing bad medicine to the tribe. When the council decided I should be set aside, he did not speak for me. And that's why they did this." Elias gestured to her injuries. This was because I spoke against the decision, because I said that a woman's worth should not be measured only by the children she bears, because I refused to go quietly into exile. Her eyes flashed with remembered anger. They said I was becoming too much like the white women, thinking I had rights beyond what men granted me. Elias paused in his ministrations, a bandage half tied in his hands. Do you think you have those rights? She met his gaze directly. Don't you think I should? It was a loaded question, one that touched on everything he had been taught about the proper order of things, about the roles men and women were supposed to play in the grand theater of life. But looking at this woman who had endured torture rather than accept injustice, who had chosen exile over submission, he found his answer came easily. Yes, he said, I do. Something shifted in her expression, then a wall's coming down. A trust tentatively offered. Your wife, she said, what was she like? The question hit him like a physical blow, as mentions of Martha always did. But for the first time in years, the pain was accompanied by something else, a desire to remember the good times rather than just the loss. Strong, he said finally. Like you. She would have liked you, I think. She always said that courage came in different forms, but the rarest kind was the courage to stand up for what was right, even when it cost you everything. She sounds like a wise woman. She was. Elias finished tying the bandage and sat back. She died 5 years ago, her and our daughter both. Fever. I am sorry, Takina said, and he could hear in her voice that she truly meant it. To lose a child, there is no greater pain. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two people who had both lost everything they thought mattered, finding an unexpected kinship in their shared wounds. Outside, the desert wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them both that they were very much alone in a harsh and unforgiving world. What happens now? Takina asked finally. Elias looked around the cabin that had once been filled with love and laughter and was now just a shelter for broken dreams. I don't know, he admitted. I've been asking myself that question for 5 years, and I still don't have an answer. Your people will not approve of me being here. My people are dead, he said with a finality that surprised him. Everyone else is just neighbors. Takina studied his face in the lamplight, and he could see her trying to decide whether to believe him, whether to trust that this strange white man who had pulled her from the desert might actually mean what he said. I should tell you, she said carefully, that my presence here will bring danger. My people, they will not simply let me go, and yours will see harboring me as a betrayal. Elias considered this, weighing the risks against the alternative of sending her back out into the desert to die. It should have been an easy calculation, one woman's life against his own safety and peace of mind. But as he looked at her sitting on Martha's sofa, wrapped in one of Martha's quilts, he realized that the equation wasn't that simple. Maybe, he said slowly, it's time I stopped worrying so much about what other people think and started worrying about what I can live with. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Takina nodded slowly, as if she understood that he wasn't just talking about her situation anymore, but about the choice every person had to make between safety and principle, between the easy path and the right one. Then I will stay, she said, for now, until I am healed and can decide what comes next. Elias felt something ease in his chest, a tension he hadn't even realized he was carrying. Good, he said. I'll make up a bed for you in Sarah's room. It's not much, but it's private and comfortable. As he prepared the small bedroom that had once belonged to his daughter, dusting off furniture, changing sheets that hadn't been disturbed in years, trying to make the space welcoming rather than a shrine to grief, Elias found himself wondering what Martha would think of what he was doing. Would she approve of him helping this woman, or would she worry about the consequences? But as he smoothed the quilt over the narrow bed and placed a fresh candle on the nightstand, he thought he knew the answer. Martha had never been one to turn away from someone in need. regardless of the cost or the complications. She had always said that kindness was not a weakness, but a strength, and that the measure of a person's character was found in how they treated those who could do nothing for them in return. When he returned to the main room, he found Takina standing by the window looking out at the darkening landscape. Even injured and exhausted, she held herself with a dignity that spoke of nobility, of a strength that went deeper than physical endurance. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Lonely, but beautiful. It gets easier." Elias lied because the loneliness had never gotten easier, only more familiar. "The quiet, I mean. After a while, you stop noticing it." She turned to look at him, and he had the unsettling feeling that she could see right through his deception. "Do you?" she asked. "Or do you just get better at pretending it doesn't hurt?" The question hit closer to home than he was comfortable with, exposing truths he had spent 5 years trying to bury. "Maybe both," he admitted. "I think," Takina said carefully, "that some kinds of loneliness are meant to be shared." And as the last light faded from the western sky and the first stars began to appear in the vast dome of night above them, Elias Ward found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, she was right. The cabin settled into evening quiet, but for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel oppressive. Instead, it felt like the pause between movements in a symphony pregnant with possibility and change. Outside, coyotes began their nightly chorus, calling to each other across the empty miles, and inside, 2 wounded souls began the delicate process of learning to trust again. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, questions about Takina's presence, decisions about the future, and the inevitable confrontation with a world that would not approve of the choice Elias had made. But tonight, for the first time since he had buried his wife and daughter on the hillside behind his home, Elias Ward did not go to sleep alone with his ghosts. And perhaps that was enough to begin with. Dawn broke over the New Mexico territory with the subtle violence of a blade cutting silk, painting the eastern mountains in shades of amber and rose, while the western sky still clung to the deep purple of night. Elias had been awake for an hour, standing on his porch, with a cup of coffee that had grown cold in his hands, watching the familiar ritual of sunrise while his mind wrestled with the magnitude of what he had done. Inside his cabin, an Apache woman slept in his daughter's bed, a woman whose very presence could bring war to his doorstep. He should have been terrified, should have been planning how to get her out of his life before anyone discovered what he had done. Instead, he found himself listening for sounds of movement from within, worried that her injuries might be worse than they appeared, that she might slip away in the night, like so many other things he had failed to protect. The sound of footsteps behind him was so soft he almost missed it. When he turned, Takina stood in the doorway, wrapped in Martha's old shawl, her face pale but determined. She moved carefully, favoring her left side, where the worst of the whip marks had left their cruel signature, but she was standing, and there was something in her posture that spoke of a strength that even brutal treatment couldn't break. "You should be resting," Elias said, setting down his coffee cup and moving toward her. "Those wounds need time to heal." "Wounds heal faster when the body moves," she replied, stepping onto the porch despite his concerned expression. "And I have never been good at lying still when there is work to be done." "Work?" Elias raised an eyebrow. "You're barely able to stand, and you're thinking about work." Takina's smile was small but genuine. "A woman who does not work is a burden. I will not be a burden to you, Elias Ward." There was something in the way she said his name that made it sound different, not the casual familiarity of neighbors or the distant politeness of strangers, but something in between, a careful testing of boundaries. He realized that she was as uncertain about their situation as he was, feeling her way through unfamiliar territory just as he was. "You're not a burden," he said firmly. "You're a guest, and guests are supposed to rest and recover, not worry about earning their keep." "Guest?" She tested the word like she was tasting something foreign. Among my people there are no guests, only family and enemies. Which am I to you?" The question hung in the morning air between them, heavy with implications that neither of them was quite ready to explore. Elias found himself studying her face in the growing light, the proud cheekbones, the intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything, the mouth that could be soft, with vulnerability one moment and hard, with determination the next. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "I guess we'll have to figure that out as we go." She nodded as if this was exactly the answer she had expected, perhaps even hoped for. "Then while we figure it out, I will work. It is who I am." Before he could protest further, she was moving past him toward the barn, her steps careful but purposeful. Elias followed, partly to make sure she didn't collapse, and partly because he was genuinely curious to see what she considered work in her current condition. The barn was a testament to his gradual surrender to grief tools, scattered where he had dropped them, stalls that hadn't been properly cleaned in months, equipment that needed repair, sitting neglected in corners. He saw it all through her eyes and felt a flush of embarrassment at how far he had let things slide. Takina said nothing about the state of the barn, but he watched her take it all in with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. Instead, she moved to where his few remaining chickens pecked at scattered grain, clucking and fussing in their endless search for food. "They are hungry," she observed, bending carefully to examine their feeding area, "and their water is dirty." Elias felt his face grow warm with shame. The chickens had been Martha's pride and joy, and he had let them become just another reminder of his failure to maintain the life they had built together. "I've been distracted lately." "Grief is a hunger that devours everything else," Takina said softly, straightening slowly, "but animals should not suffer for our pain." Without waiting for his response, she began gathering grain from the scattered supplies, moving with the fluid efficiency of someone who had grown up caring for animals. Her movements were hampered by her injuries, but there was something almost meditative about the way she worked, as if the simple act of caring for other living things was healing something inside her as well. "You don't have to do this," Elias said, but his protest lacked conviction. There was something deeply moving about watching her tend to creatures that weren't even hers, showing kindness to animals that belonged to a man she barely knew. "Yes, I do," she replied, scattering grain with practiced precision. "If I am to stay here even for a little while, then this place becomes part of my responsibility. That is how women think." "Is that how Apache women think, or how you think?" She paused in her work to look at him, and he saw something flicker across her expression, surprise perhaps that he had made the distinction. "I do not know any more," she said finally. "I thought I knew who I was, what I believed, what was expected of me. But when your own people cast you out..." She shrugged, the gesture speaking volumes about the fundamental shift in her understanding of herself and her place in the world. They worked in companionable silence for the next hour, Takina tending to the chickens, while Elias tackled some of the neglected maintenance that had been weighing on his conscience for months. It felt strange having another person moving through his space, sharing his morning routine, but it was a good kind of strange, like a muscle that had been cramped for years, finally beginning to relax. As the sun climbed higher and the heat began to build, Elias found himself stealing glances at his unexpected companion. Despite her injuries, despite being cast out by her own people and taken in by a stranger, she moved through her tasks with a grace that spoke of deep inner strength. There was something almost regal about her bearing, as if being beaten and abandoned had only refined her natural dignity rather than breaking it. "Tell me about your family," she said, suddenly breaking the comfortable quiet. "Before the fever, what were they like?" The question caught him off guard, as mentions of Martha and Sarah always did, but this time the pain was tempered by something else, a genuine desire to share their memory with someone who might understand what they had meant to him. "Martha was..." He paused, searching for words that could capture the essence of a woman who had been everything to him. "She was like sunrise after a long night," No matter how dark things got, she always found a reason to hope to keep going. She made everything better just by being there. And your daughter, Sarah, was pure joy, he said, surprising himself with the smile that touched his lips. She talked to everything: the chickens, the horses, the flowers in Martha's garden. She was convinced that if she just talked enough, eventually everything would talk back. Did anything ever talk back to her? Elias considered the question seriously. Me, Martha, the old tomcat that used to live in the barn. I think that was enough for her. Takina's smile was soft and sad. Children have a way of making the world larger and smaller at the same time. Larger because they see possibilities everywhere, smaller because they make home feel like the center of everything important. You speak like someone who wanted children of her own. The words were out before he could stop them, and he immediately regretted the intrusion into what was obviously painful territory. But Takina didn't seem offended by the observation. I did want them, she said quietly. I dreamed of little ones running through our village carrying my features and their father's strength. I dreamed of teaching daughters how to gather roots and prepare medicine, of watching sons learn to hunt and ride. But the spirits had other plans. Maybe the spirits are still working on their plans, Elias suggested gently. Maybe what happened to you wasn't an ending, but a beginning. She looked at him sharply, as if trying to determine whether he was offering genuine comfort or empty platitudes. Whatever she saw in his expression seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded slowly. Among my people, we believe that every ending creates space for a new beginning, she said. But sometimes the space between the ending and the beginning feels like falling through darkness. I know that feeling, Elias admitted. I've been falling for 5 years. Their eyes met across the barn, and for a moment, the air between them seemed charged with understanding. Two people who had lost everything they thought defined them, finding themselves in an impossible situation that might, against all odds, offer a chance at something new. The moment was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Elias felt every muscle in his body tense as he recognized the distinctive rhythm of multiple riders moving at a steady pace, not the desperate flight of someone being pursued, but the purposeful advance of people who knew exactly where they were going and why. He moved quickly to the barn door, peering out toward the dust cloud rising from the direction of town. Company, Takina asked, but her tone suggested she already knew this wasn't a social call. 3 riders, Elias confirmed, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle he always kept nearby. Moving like they've got business here. Takina joined him at the door, and he could feel the tension radiating from her body like heat from a forge. Apache. No. He squinted against the morning glare, trying to make out details. White men, probably from town, which was in many ways worse than Apache raiders. Apache warriors would come fast and hard, interested in quick violence or quick departure. White men from town would come with questions, suspicions, and the kind of moral certainty that could turn a simple conversation into a life-changing confrontation. You should go inside, Elias said quietly. Stay out of sight until we know what they want. And if what they want is me, the question hung between them, heavy with implications. Because if word had somehow gotten out about Takina's presence here, if someone had seen him bring her back or noticed signs of another person around the ranch, then this conversation was going to become very complicated very quickly. Then we'll deal with that when it happens, Elias said, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. But right now, I'd rather not borrow trouble. Takina studied his face for a moment, then nodded and melted back into the shadows of the barn, with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to make herself invisible when necessary. Elias checked his rifle, made sure his pistol was secure in its holster, and walked out to meet his visitors with the careful confidence of a man who had nothing to hide and everything to protect. The 3 riders resolved into familiar faces as they drew near Tom Morrison, the town sheriff, flanked by Pete Jameson and Bill Crawford, 2 of the more prominent ranchers in the area. All three men Elias knew well enough to call friends, or at least friendly acquaintances. All three men who would have very strong opinions about harboring an Apache woman regardless of the circumstances. "Morning, Elias," Sheriff Morrison called out as they approached, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "Hope you don't mind us dropping by unannounced." "Tom, Pete, Bill." Elias nodded to each man in turn, keeping his voice casual despite the tension coiling in his gut. "What brings you all the way out here must be something important to get you riding before the heat really sets in." Morrison dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose back reminded him daily that he was no longer 20. He was a good sheriff, fair, honest, and more interested in keeping the peace than in making a reputation for himself. But he was also a man who understood the delicate balance of relationships that kept their corner of the territory from exploding into the kind of violence that plagued other areas. "We've had some concerning reports," Morrison said, his tone carefully neutral. "Thought we ought to check them out, make sure everything's settled out here." "What kind of reports?" Elias asked, though his heart was already sinking. In a territory where neighbors might be separated by 20 miles of empty desert, news traveled with the efficiency of wildfire, often growing more dramatic with each telling. Pete Jameson, a red-faced man whose prosperity showed in his expanding belly, leaned forward in his saddle. "Miguel Santos was driving cattle through Devil's Canyon yesterday morning. Said he saw you riding double heading back toward your spread. Man's got a right to ride his own land however he sees fit." Elias replied evenly, but his mind was racing. Miguel was a good man and a reliable witness. If he had seen Elias with Takina, there would be no denying it. "Course he does," Bill Crawford chimed in. Crawford was younger than the other two, with the kind of aggressive ambition that made him quick to see threats where none existed. "But Miguel said your passenger looked like it might have been an Indian, Apache specifically." The words hung in the morning air like smoke from a poorly tended fire, visible, acrid, and impossible to ignore. Elias felt the familiar weight of a decision point, one of those moments where a man's choice would define not just his immediate future, but the kind of person he would be for the rest of his life. "Miguel's eyes aren't what they used to be," Elias said carefully. "Man sees mirages in clear weather. Wouldn't be the first time distance and heat played tricks on someone." Morrison's expression remained neutral, but Elias could see the sheriff weighing his words, testing them against what he knew about both Miguel's reliability and Elias's character. "That's possible," he agreed, "but we had to check it out. You understand?" "I understand you've got a job to do, Tom, but I'm not sure what you're really asking me." "He's asking," Crawford said with the bluntness of youth, "whether you're harboring hostiles on your property. Because if you are, that's not just your problem, it's everyone's problem." Elias felt his temper flare at the younger man's tone, but he kept his voice level. "And I'm telling you that Miguel Santos saw what he thought he saw from a distance in heat shimmer while he was focused on moving cattle. If that's enough evidence to constitute an accusation, then we're all in trouble." "Nobody's making accusations," Morrison said quickly, shooting Crawford a warning look. "We're just trying to get the facts straight. These are dangerous times, Elias. Tensions are high and people are scared. Any hint of Apache activity, even friendly contact, gets folks worked up." "There's no such thing as friendly contact with Apache," Crawford added with the certainty of someone who had never actually met an Apache, but had heard plenty of stories. "They're all hostiles, every last one of them." "That's enough, Bill," Morrison said sharply. "We're here to gather information, not to debate Indian policy." But Crawford was warming to his theme, riding the kind of righteous anger that made men dangerous. "You see what they did to the Henderson family last month? Found them scalped and mutilated, even the children. These aren't people, Sheriff, they're animals, and anyone who deals with them is a traitor to their own kind." Elias felt something cold and hard settle in his chest as he listened to Crawford's words, because while the young rancher was spouting the kind of inflammatory rhetoric that passed for wisdom in too many saloons and general stores, Elias was thinking about Takina's intelligent eyes, her gentle care for his chickens, her quiet dignity in the face of brutal treatment by her own people. "The Henderson family was killed by Comanche raiders," he said quietly, "not Apache. And if you're going to use their deaths to justify hatred, at least get your facts straight." Crawford's face flushed red above his collar. "Indians and Indian Ward, they're all the same when it comes to killing white folks." "No," Elias said, and there was something in his voice that made all three men straighten in their saddles. "They're not. Any more than all white men are the same when it comes to treating people with basic human decency." The insult hit home, and Crawford's hand moved toward the pistol at his hip before Morrison's sharp command froze him in place. "That's enough," the sheriff said firmly. "We're not here to fight among ourselves." He turned back to Elias, and there was something in his expression that suggested he understood more than he was saying. "Elias, I need to ask you directly, are you harboring any Apache on your property?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Elias found himself at one of those crossroads that define a man's life. He could lie, deny everything, and hope that Morrison would accept his word and leave. It would be the safe choice, the smart choice, the choice that would preserve his standing in the community and keep him out of trouble. But as he opened his mouth to speak, he thought about Takina's courage in speaking against injustice, even when it cost her everything. He thought about Martha's voice saying that a man's character was measured by what he did when nobody was watching. He thought about the kind of man he wanted to be and the kind of legacy he wanted to leave. "Yes," he said simply, "I am." The words fell into silence like stones into a deep well, and Elias watched as their implications rippled across the faces of the three men before him. Morrison's expression remained carefully neutral, but Pete Jameson's eyes widened with shock, and Crawford's face darkened with something that looked like vindicated rage. "Jesus Christ, Ward," Jameson breathed. "What the hell are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," Elias replied evenly, "that I found a human being who had been beaten half to death and left to die in the desert, and I chose to help rather than ride away." "A human being?" Crawford's voice cracked with outrage. "It's an Apache. They're savages, murderers, and you brought one onto your property, put all of us at risk. She's a woman who was cast out by her own people and left to die," Elias said, his voice growing harder with each word. "A woman who needed help and who posed no threat to anyone. She—" Morrison's eyebrows rose. "You're harboring an Apache woman. Her name is Takina, and yes, I'm giving her shelter while she recovers from her injuries." Crawford was practically vibrating with anger now. This is exactly the kind of bleeding heart stupidity that gets good people killed. You've probably signed all our death warrants. The only person who's threatened violence here today is you, Bill, Elias observed calmly. "Seems to me you're more dangerous than she is." That struck home, and Crawford's hand moved again toward his weapon before Morrison's sharp voice cut through the tension. "Nobody draws iron on my watch," the sheriff said with the kind of authority that came from years of dealing with men whose tempers ran hotter than their good sense. "And nobody makes threats either." He turned back to Elias, and the weight of difficult decisions was clear in his weathered features. "Elias, you know I respect you as a man and a neighbor, but this situation, it's complicated. People are scared, and when people are scared, they make bad decisions. People are making bad decisions because they're choosing fear over humanity," Elias replied. "I won't be part of that." "You're already part of it," Morrison said quietly. "The moment you brought her here, you made yourself part of it, and now I have to figure out what to do about it." The conversation was interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps behind them. Elias didn't need to turn around to know that Takina had decided to end the charade, to step out of the shadows and face whatever consequences her presence would bring. He heard the sharp intake of breath from the three men, as they got their first look at her, and he found himself tensing for whatever reaction her appearance might provoke. She stood in the doorway of the barn, wrapped in one of Martha's shawls, her dark hair catching the morning light, and her extraordinary eyes taking in the scene with calm assessment. Despite her injuries, despite being outnumbered, and facing men who viewed her as an enemy, she carried herself with a dignity that was impossible to ignore. "Gentlemen," she said in clear, unaccented English, inclining her head slightly in greeting, "I am Takina. I believe you are here because of me." The simple grace of her introduction seemed to catch all three men off guard. Crawford's mouth fell open slightly, as if he had expected her to appear with war paint and a tomahawk, rather than speaking politely in perfect English. Jameson shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, clearly struggling to reconcile his preconceptions with the reality of the woman standing before them. It was Morrison who recovered first, touching his hat brim in an automatic gesture of courtesy that seemed to surprise him as much as anyone else. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I'm Sheriff Morrison. These are Pete Jameson and Bill Crawford." "I am honored to meet you," Takina replied with formal politeness, "though I regret that my presence has caused concern." "Concern?" Crawford found his voice, and it came out as a strangled squeak, before he cleared his throat and tried again. "Lady, you're Apache. Your people have been raiding and killing throughout this territory for years." "My people," Takina said with quiet dignity, "cast me out and left me to die for speaking against injustice. I am no longer Apache, gentlemen. I am simply a woman who has been shown unexpected kindness by a good man." The words hit like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples of confusion and discomfort among the three visitors, because whatever they had expected to find at Elias's ranch, it wasn't this, an articulate, dignified woman who spoke of being cast out by her own people, who showed no hostility or threat to anyone. Cast out, Morrison's lawman instincts kicked in, searching for the truth beneath surface appearances. What for? Takina's smile was bitter as winter wind. "I failed to bear children for my husband. When the council decided this made me cursed, I spoke against their judgment. They decided that exile was too merciful a punishment." She turned slightly, and even through the shawl the men could see the evidence of the brutal beating she had endured. Jameson actually flinched, and even Crawford seemed taken aback by the visible proof of the cruelty she had suffered. "Good God," Jameson breathed. "Your own people did that to you." "My former people," Takina corrected gently. "I have no people now except for the one who chose to save my life when he could have ridden past." The simple statement hung in the air, and Elias could see the three men struggling with the implications, because it was one thing to hate and fear a faceless enemy, and quite another to maintain that hatred when faced with a woman who had been brutalized by those same enemies and abandoned to die. Morrison was the first to work through the complexities. "So you're saying you're not part of any tribe anymore, that you're not in contact with any Apache bands?" "I am saying that I am dead to my people, and they to me," Takina replied. "I have nowhere to go, no one to return to. I exist only because this man chose mercy over convenience." Crawford wasn't ready to let go of his anger. "That's a convenient story. How do we know you're not a spy sent to scout our defenses and report back?" The question might have been offensive, but Takina answered it with the same calm dignity she had shown throughout the conversation. "You know because I am telling you the truth, and because a spy would not reveal herself so openly. You know because Mr. Ward found me dying in the desert, beaten and abandoned. And you know because if I were here with hostile intent, I would not be feeding his chickens and mending his fences." Mending his fences. Morrison's eyebrows rose. "Work is healing," Takina said simply, "and I will not be a burden to the man who saved my life." There was something about her directness, her refusal to show fear or plead for sympathy, that seemed to affect all three men, Even Crawford appeared to be struggling with the cognitive dissonance between his expectations and the reality before him. "This is all very touching," Crawford said finally, but with less conviction than before. "But it doesn't change the fact that harboring an Apache, any Apache, puts all of us at risk. What happens when her people come looking for her?" "They will not come," Takina said with quiet certainty. "I am dead to them. They believe I have been consumed by the desert as they intended. They have no reason to search for ghosts." "But what if they do?" Jameson pressed. "What if other Apache discover you're here? Won't they see it as us taking in one of theirs, protecting someone they cast out?" Takina considered the question seriously. "If they discover me, they will see it as a white man harboring a woman they have already judged and punished. They may be angry, but they will not be surprised. Apache understand that white men often make choices based on sentiment rather than wisdom." The backhanded compliment drew a surprised chuckle from Morrison, who seemed to be finding the entire situation more complex than he had anticipated. "You have an interesting way of looking at things, ma'am." "I have learned to see clearly," Takina replied. "It is a skill that comes from having illusions stripped away." Morrison studied her for a long moment, then turned back to Elias. "This is your land, and she's your responsibility. But I need your word that if there's any sign of trouble, any indication that her presence is attracting the wrong kind of attention, you'll let me know. No, immediately." "You have it," Elias said without hesitation, "and I need her word that she won't try to make contact with any Apache bands, won't try to send messages or signals that might bring trouble to this area." Takina's laugh was soft and sad. "Sheriff Morrison, I give you my word that I will not contact people who would kill me on sight for the crime of still being alive." "Such a promise is easy to make." Crawford wasn't satisfied yet. "What about the other folks in the territory? They're not going to be comfortable knowing there's an Apache living among us, cast out or not." "Then perhaps," Takina said quietly, "they should consider what it means that even her own people found her too inconvenient to tolerate. If the Apache cast me out for speaking against cruelty, what does that say about the kind of person I am?" The question hung in the air, and Elias could see the three men grappling with the implications. Because if Takina had been cast out for opposing the very qualities that made her people enemies, then her presence might actually represent safety rather than danger. Morrison seemed to reach the same conclusion. "All right," he said finally, "here's how this is going to work. Officially, I never saw anything more than Elias Ward taking in a woman who needed help. Unofficially, if word gets out and people start asking questions, I'm going to refer them to the fact that this woman was rejected by the Apache for being too soft-hearted to suit them." "That's not exactly what happened," Takina said. "Close enough for government work," Morrison replied with a slight smile. "The point is, if people are going to be afraid of you, they should at least be afraid for the right reasons." Crawford still looked unhappy with the entire situation. "This is going to come back to bite us all. Mark my words." "Maybe," Morrison agreed, "but right now the only person I see causing trouble is you, Bill. And if you can't handle having one displaced woman in the territory without starting a war, maybe you should consider whether you're really suited for frontier life." The insult hit home, and Crawford's face flushed red again, but before he could respond, Jameson spoke up. "Tom's right, Bill. If we can't show mercy to someone who's already been punished by their own people, what does that make us?" He looked at Takina with something approaching respect. "Ma'am, I can't say I'm comfortable with this situation, but I can see you're not the threat some folks might think you are." "Thank you for your honesty," Takina replied. "It is more than many would offer." Morrison gathered his reins, clearly ready to bring the conversation to a close. "Elias, I trust you to handle this situation responsibly. And ma'am," he addressed Takina directly, "I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for out here." "I have already found more than I dared hope for," she replied, glancing at Elias with something that might have been gratitude or might have been something deeper. Sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. As the three men prepared to leave, Crawford couldn't resist one final shot. "This isn't over, Ward. People are going to find out, and when they do, don't expect the rest of us to stand with you against the consequences." "I wouldn't dream of asking you to stand for anything that required actual courage, Bill," Elias replied evenly. "I know that's not really your strong suit." Crawford's face went purple, but Morrison's sharp command cut off whatever response he might have made. "That's enough from both of you. Bill, you're done talking. Elias, you've made your position clear." As the three riders disappeared into the heat shimmer of the morning, raising a small dust cloud that quickly dissipated in the still air, Elias found himself standing beside Takina, in a silence that felt different from the comfortable quiet they had shared earlier. Now the weight of consequences pressed down on them both, the knowledge that their situation had become more complicated and more dangerous. "That went better than I expected," Takina said finally. "Crawford's going to be a problem," Elias replied. "He's the kind of man who can't let things go, especially when he thinks his authority has been challenged." "And the sheriff." Elias considered Morrison's behavior during the confrontation. "Tom's a good man trying to do a difficult job. He'll keep his word as long as we don't give him a reason to regret it." They stood watching the dust settle in the distance, both of them aware that their quiet morning had ended and that the complicated business of living with their choices was just beginning. But as Elias glanced at the woman beside him, saw the way she held herself with dignity, despite everything she had endured, he found that he didn't regret his decision to help her. If anything, he was beginning to think that maybe for the first time in 5 years, he had finally done something that Martha would have been proud of. The dust from the sheriff's departure had barely settled when Elias realized that their confrontation with the law had been only the opening act of a much larger drama. Word would spread now, rippling outward from Crawford's loose tongue like waves from a stone thrown into still water, carrying news of the Apache woman living at the Ward Ranch to every saloon, general store, and kitchen table in the territory. Over the following days, that prediction proved grimly accurate. The first sign came when Miguel Santos rode by ostensibly to check on some stray cattle, but spent most of his time stealing glances toward the cabin and asking careful questions about Elias's health and whether he needed any help with his situation. The kindly Mexican rancher's concern was genuine, but so was his curiosity about the woman he had glimpsed from a distance. "She is very beautiful, this woman," Miguel said carefully as they stood by the corral, watching Takina scatter grain for the chickens with the same methodical care she brought to everything. "And she moves like someone who knows the land." "She does," Elias agreed, offering no additional information. Miguel nodded slowly, understanding the boundaries of the conversation. "Sometimes the desert brings us what we need even when we do not know we need it. But the desert also brings storms, amigo. You should be ready for weather." The warning proved prophetic. By the end of the week, a steady stream of visitors had found excuses to ride out to the ranch. Some came with transparent pretexts, returning tools they had never borrowed, offering to help with work that didn't need doing, bringing news that could have waited months. Others were more direct, like Tom Brewster from the general store, who arrived with supplies Elias hadn't ordered and a blunt assessment of the situation. "Folks in town are talking Ward," Brewster said, unloading sacks of flour and beans from his wagon while his eyes tracked Takina's movements around the barnyard. "Some are saying you've lost your mind with grief. Others think you're up to something more calculated." "What do you think, Tom?" Elias asked, helping to carry the supplies despite not having requested them. Brewster was quiet for a moment, watching Takina work with the focused efficiency that characterized everything she did. "I think you're a man who's been alone too long, and maybe loneliness makes people do things they wouldn't normally consider, but I also think you're not a fool, so there must be more to this than what it looks like." "And what does it look like?" "Like a man who's harboring an enemy of his own people for reasons nobody can quite figure out." Brewster's tone was carefully neutral, but his eyes were sharp as he studied Elias's face. question is whether those reasons are good enough to justify the risks you're taking. The risks became more apparent as the days passed. Elias noticed that some of his neighbors had stopped returning his greetings when their paths crossed. Others went out of their way to avoid contact altogether, taking longer routes to town rather than pass by his ranch. The casual friendships and comfortable relationships that had sustained him through the worst of his grief began to evaporate like morning dew under the harsh sun of community disapproval. But perhaps the most telling sign of how the wind was shifting came when Father Miguel, the elderly priest who served the scattered Catholic families in the area, made an unexpected visit to the ranch. The old man's arrival was announced by the creaking of wagon wheels and the gentle voice raised in Spanish hymns, and Elias found himself genuinely glad to see the priest's weathered face and hind eyes. "Father," Elias greeted him, helping the elderly man down from his wagon. "This is an unexpected pleasure." "My son," Father Miguel replied in his careful English, heavily accented but clear, "I heard there were souls here in need of comfort, and I could not stay away." The priest's eyes found Takina, who had emerged from the cabin at the sound of voices, and Elias watched the old man's expression shift from curiosity to something deeper, recognition, perhaps, of suffering that transcended cultural boundaries. "This is Takina," Elias said simply. "Takina, this is Father Miguel. He tends to the spiritual needs of folks in these parts." Takina approached slowly, her natural wariness warring with obvious respect for the priest's age and position. When she spoke, it was in Spanish, that surprised both men with its fluency and formal courtesy. "Father, I am honored by your visit, though I fear I am not of your faith." Father Miguel's eyes widened at her perfect pronunciation and grammatical precision. "Child, you speak the language of my heart, as if you were born to it. Where did you learn such beautiful Spanish?" "From the priests at the mission school many years ago before." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Before my path took me in other directions." The old priest nodded slowly, understanding more than he said. "The priests at San Miguel de Allende were good teachers, I think. They taught you well." "They taught me that kindness exists in many forms," Takina replied, "and that sometimes salvation comes from unexpected sources." Father Miguel glanced meaningfully at Elias, then back to Takina. "Indeed, child, indeed it does." He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "I have come because there are those who believe that what is happening here is dangerous, that harboring you puts the entire community at risk." "And what do you believe, Father?" Takina asked quietly. The old priest was silent for a long moment, his eyes taking in her bearing, her obvious injuries, the way she stood close enough to Elias to suggest trust, but far enough away to maintain proper distance. "I believe," he said finally, "that I see a woman who has suffered greatly and a man who chose mercy over convenience. If that is dangerous, then perhaps we have forgotten what it means to follow the teachings of Christ." His words carried weight in a territory where the church still held significant influence over community sentiment, and Elias felt a surge of gratitude for the old man's wisdom and courage. But Father Miguel wasn't finished. However, he continued, his tone growing more serious. "I must also tell you that there are those who see this situation as a test of loyalties. There is talk of organizing a delegation to encourage a different resolution to the problem." The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the threat inherent in his words, and Elias felt his stomach tighten. "What kind of delegation?" "The kind that believes problems are best solved by removing them entirely," Father Miguel replied sadly. "I fear that Bill Crawford has been very vocal in his opinions about the proper way to handle Apache, even Apache who have been cast out by their own people." Takina's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly, but her voice remained calm. "When? Soon, I think, perhaps within the week. That is why I came to warn you and to offer what help I can." "What kind of help?" Elias asked. Father Miguel reached into his wagon and withdrew a rolled document sealed with wax. A letter of safe passage written in my hand and bearing the seal of the church. It states that the bearer is under the protection of the mission and traveling on church business. It would allow the lady to reach the sanctuary of San Miguel de Allende, where she would be safe from those who would do her harm. Elias felt Takina's eyes on him as he took the letter, understanding the weight of what the priest was offering. Safety for her, but at the cost of separation, of ending whatever had begun to grow between them during these strange, tense days. "Father," Takina said softly, "your kindness honors your faith. But I must ask, why do you offer this help to someone who is not of your church, not of your people?" The old priest's smile was gentle and sad. "Because, child, I have seen enough of hatred to recognize love when it appears. And love, true love, is always worth protecting, regardless of the forms it takes or the obstacles it faces." His words hung in the air between them, giving voice to something that neither Elias nor Takina had dared to name. Because during the days since her arrival, something had indeed begun to grow between them. Tentative, unspoken, complicated by every imaginable obstacle, but real nonetheless. It had started with small things. The way Takina always had coffee ready when Elias came in from his morning rounds, prepared exactly the way he liked it, despite his never telling her his preferences. The way he found himself working closer to the cabin during the day, drawn by the sound of her voice as she sang softly in Apache while she worked. The way their conversations had evolved from careful politeness to genuine exchange of thoughts and feelings. It was in the way she had begun to anticipate his needs without being asked, and the way he had started planning his days around her comfort and safety. It was in the long evenings they spent on the porch talking about everything and nothing while the desert settled into twilight around them. It was in the careful distance they maintained, even as they grew closer, both aware that whatever was happening between them defied every social convention and practical consideration. "Father," Elias said finally, "I appreciate the offer more than I can say, but that decision isn't mine to make." He turned to Takina, seeing his own conflicted emotions reflected in her extraordinary eyes, because while the rational part of his mind knew that Father Miguel's offer represented her best chance at safety and a normal life, the thought of her leaving felt like contemplating another kind of death. "What do you want to do?" he asked quietly. Takina looked from Elias to the priest, and back again, and for a moment her carefully maintained composure slipped, revealing the uncertainty and fear beneath. "I do not know," she admitted. "Part of me wants to run to take the Father's generous offer and disappear before I bring more trouble to the man who saved my life. But part of me," she trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. But Elias understood what she couldn't say because he felt it too, the growing connection between them, the sense that they had found something rare and precious in the midst of all the chaos and hatred surrounding them. "Part of you wants to stay," he said softly. "Yes." The word was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a confession. "Part of me wants to stay and see what might grow between us, despite all the reasons why it's impossible." Father Miguel watched this exchange with the knowing eyes of someone who had counseled countless souls through the complexities of love and loss. "My children," he said gently, "the heart does not always choose wisely, but it chooses truly. The question you must answer is whether you are willing to fight for what your hearts are telling you, or whether the cost is too high to pay." Before either of them could respond, the sound of approaching horses cut through the evening air, multiple riders moving fast, the thunder of hooves suggesting urgency or anger, or both. Elias felt his blood turn to ice as he recognized the sound that had haunted his nightmares for weeks, the approach of men with violence on their minds. "Get inside," he told Takina urgently, but she was already moving toward the cabin, with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to disappear when necessary. Father Miguel began gathering his things with the practiced efficiency of a man who had found himself in the middle of other people's troubles before. The riders came into view as dust clouds on the horizon, resolving quickly into a group of 8 men, all armed, all riding with the grim purpose of a posse or a lynching party. At their head rode Bill Crawford, his face set in lines of righteous anger, flanked by men Elias recognized from town shopkeepers and ranchers and drifters who had found common cause in their hatred of anything Apache. They pulled up in a semicircle in front of the cabin horses, snorting and stamping dust swirling around them like the smoke of battle. Crawford dismounted with theatrical flair, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol as he faced Elias across 20 feet of ground that suddenly felt like a battlefield. "Ward," Crawford said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air, "we've come to talk." "Then talk," Elias replied, his own hand moving instinctively toward his rifle. "But keep it civil. We've got a priest present." Crawford's eyes flicked to Father Miguel, and some of the bluster went out of his posture. Even in his anger, he wasn't quite ready to threaten violence in front of a man of God. "Father," he said with grudging respect, "this isn't church business. All business that involves the souls in my care is church business." Father Miguel replied calmly, "And I count both Mr. Ward and the lady among those souls." "The lady?" Crawford's voice cracked with outrage. "Father, that's no lady, that's an Apache, a savage who shouldn't be living among civilized people. I see a woman who has suffered greatly and a man who chose to show mercy." The priest replied with unshakable calm, "If that troubles you, perhaps you should examine your own heart to see what you find there." One of the other riders, a thin man named Jackson, who ran the livery stable, leaned forward in his saddle. "Father, with all due respect, this isn't about mercy. It's about safety. Having an Apache living among us puts everyone at risk." "From what?" Elias asked pointedly. "She's been here for weeks, and the only violence I've seen threatened has come from white men." "The violence will come when her people discover she's here," Crawford shot back. "When they see that we're harboring one of theirs protecting someone they cast out, they'll see it as an act of war." "Her own people left her to die," Elias replied. "They're not coming to rescue someone they've already written off as dead." But even as he spoke the words, Elias felt a chill of uncertainty, because while everything he knew about Takina's situation suggested that the Apache considered her dead and gone, he couldn't entirely dismiss the possibility that her continued existence might eventually come to their attention. That uncertainty was resolved with shocking suddenness when one of the men in Crawford's group, a young cowboy named Peters, suddenly pointed toward the eastern ridge and shouted a warning that turned everyone's blood to ice. "Riders coming in fast from the Badlands, and they're not white men." All eyes turned toward the ridge where a line of horsemen had appeared against the darkening sky, their silhouettes unmistakably Apache, in the way they sat their horses and the way they moved across the landscape. Even at a distance, their number was impressive, at least 20 warriors riding in formation with the disciplined precision of a war party. "Jesus Christ," Jackson breathed. "They found her." The Apache riders paused on the ridge, clearly visible against the backdrop of the evening sky, and for a moment the entire scene froze like a tableau. White men caught between the cabin and the approaching warriors, Father Miguel, standing calmly beside his wagon, and somewhere inside the cabin, Takina, watching the approach of the people who had cast her out and left her to die. Crawford's face had gone pale beneath his tan, but his voice remained steady. "This is what happens, Ward. This is exactly what I warned you about. You've brought war to our doorstep." But even as Crawford spoke, Elias was studying the approaching riders, noting details that didn't quite fit with his expectations of a rescue mission or a raiding party. They rode openly, making no attempt at stealth or surprise. Their formation was formal, almost ceremonial, suggesting negotiation rather than attack. And at their head rode a figure whose bearing spoke of authority and age, a chief or war leader perhaps, but one who came to talk rather than fight. "They're not attacking," Elias observed quietly. "If they wanted a fight, they wouldn't announce themselves like this." "How do you know what they want?" Crawford demanded. "You speak Apache now." Before Elias could respond, the cabin door opened, and Takina emerged, moving with calm dignity, despite the explosive tension of the moment. She had changed into traditional Apache dress, buckskin decorated with intricate beadwork that spoke of high status within the tribe. Her hair was braided in a complex pattern that Elias didn't recognize, and she carried herself with the regal bearing of someone born to command. "I speak Apache," she said simply, her voice carrying clearly in the still air, "and I know why they have come." The transformation was so complete that for a moment Elias didn't recognize the woman he had been living with for weeks. Gone was the broken, beaten figure he had found in the desert. Gone was the careful, grateful guest who had shared his meals and his conversations. In their place stood someone who looked every inch the Apache princess, beautiful and proud and utterly formidable. "They have come," Takina continued, her eyes fixed on the approaching riders, "because someone has told them that I still live. Someone has reported that the woman they left to die has been given shelter by a white man, and they have come to judge whether this changes anything." Crawford found his voice first. "Judge what? What's to judge? You're Apache, they're Apache, they've come to take you back." Takina's smile was sharp as a blade. "No, Mr. Crawford. They have not come to take me back. They have come to decide whether my continued existence is an embarrassment that must be corrected or simply an irrelevance that can be ignored." The distinction was lost on Crawford, but Elias understood immediately. The Apache hadn't come to rescue Takina. They had come to determine whether her survival undermined their decision to cast her out, and if so, to finish what they had started. "What do we do?" Father Miguel asked quietly. Takina straightened to her full height, and despite her relatively small stature, she seemed to fill the space around her with an almost visible aura of authority. "We meet them as equals," she said firmly. "We show no fear, no weakness, no guilt for the choices we have made, and we let them see that I am no longer the woman they judged and found wanting." The Apache riders had begun their descent from the ridge, moving with the unhurried confidence of people who controlled the situation completely. As they drew closer, details became clearer: war paint and feathers, weapons carried openly but not aggressively, horses decorated with the kind of ornate tack that spoke of wealth and status. At their head rode a man Elias judged to be in his 50s, with the kind of weathered face and steady bearing that spoke of a lifetime of command. This was clearly a war chief or tribal leader, someone with the authority to make decisions that would be binding on his people. Flanking him were younger warriors, their faces painted and their eyes constantly scanning for threats, but their weapons remained sheathed. The war party pulled up about 50 yards from the cabin, close enough for easy conversation, but far enough away to avoid any suggestion of threat or intimidation. The leader dismounted with fluid grace, his movements deliberate and controlled, and began walking toward the small group gathered in front of the cabin. Takina stepped forward to meet him, her own movements matching his for dignity and control. When they were about 10 feet apart, both stopped, and the leader spoke in Apache, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. Elias couldn't understand the words, but he could read the tone, formal, ceremonial, with undertones of both respect and challenge. Takina's response was equally formal, her voice strong and clear as she replied in her native language. The exchange continued for several minutes, with both participants maintaining the careful courtesy of a diplomatic negotiation. But gradually, Elias began to notice changes in tone and posture that suggested the conversation was becoming more heated. The war chief's voice grew sharper, more demanding, while Takina's responses became more defiant. Finally, the Apache leader said something that caused Takina to stiffen visibly. her hands clenching into fists at her sides. Her response was short, sharp, and delivered with the kind of finality that needed no translation. The war chief's face darkened and he took a step forward, his hand moving toward the knife at his belt. But before the situation could escalate further, Takina spoke again, this time in English that all present could understand. "I have told War Chief Many Horses that I am no longer Apache," she said, her voice carrying clearly to both groups. "I have told him that I was cast out justly, according to tribal law, and that I have accepted that judgment. I have told him that I live now under the protection of a white man who showed me mercy when my own people showed me none." Many Horses replied in accented but clear English, his words directed as much to the white men as to Takina. "The woman speaks truth. She was judged and found wanting. She was cast out to die as was proper, but she did not die, and now she lives among our enemies, sharing their food and their shelter. This brings shame to our people." "The only shame," Takina replied with quiet dignity, "belongs to those who beat a woman for speaking truth and left her to die for refusing to accept injustice quietly. I bring no shame to anyone but myself, and I accept that burden willingly." Many Horses studied her for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. When he spoke again, his words carried the weight of formal judgment. "You say you are no longer Apache. You say you have chosen to live among the white men as one of them. If this is true, then you must prove it by rejecting all that you were before." "What are you asking?" Elias interjected, stepping forward to stand beside Takina. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were building to some kind of test or challenge, and his protective instincts were screaming warnings. Many Horses looked at him with something that might have been respect. "I am asking her to choose completely. If she would live as a white woman, then she must renounce all claim to Apache blood, Apache heritage, Apache protection. She must become dead to us in spirit as well as in law." "And if she refuses?" Elias asked. The war chief's smile was cold as winter wind. "Then she remains Apache, subject to Apache law, guilty of Apache crimes. And the sentence of death that was passed upon her will be carried out as it should have been carried out before." The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire, and Elias felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he understood the full scope of what was being demanded. Takina was being asked to choose not just between life and death, but between cultures, identities, and everything that had defined her for the first 25 years of her existence. "You're asking her to stop being who she is," Elias said quietly. "I am asking her to become who she has chosen to be," Many Horses replied. "She cannot live in both worlds. She cannot be Apache when it suits her and white when it is convenient. She must choose one path and walk it completely." Takina had been silent during this exchange, her face composed, but her eyes reflecting the magnitude of the decision before her. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but soft. "And if I choose to renounce my Apache heritage completely, what then? Then you will be dead to us in all ways." Many Horses said with finality, "We will never speak your name again, never acknowledge that you ever existed. You will be cut from the memory of the people as completely as if you had never been born. But you will also be free to live among the white men without fear of Apache justice." The bargain was stark in its simplicity. Cultural death in exchange for physical life, the complete severing of all ties to her people, in return for the freedom to build a new identity among strangers. Elias found himself holding his breath as Takina considered the offer, understanding that her answer would determine not just her fate, but the shape of their future together. Because if she chose to remain Apache even in defiance of their laws, then her death would be both certain and imminent. But if she chose to renounce her heritage completely, then she would be free to become whatever she chose to be, including perhaps something more than a guest in his home. The silence stretched between them all, pregnant with possibility and consequence, while the sun continued its descent toward the western horizon and the shadows grew longer around the small drama playing out in the dusty yard of a lonely ranch in the middle of nowhere. Takina stood motionless in the gathering dusk, the weight of her decision pressing down on her like the heat of the desert sun. Around her, two groups of armed men waited for words that would either end her life or transform it completely, while the man who had saved her watched with eyes that reflected his own understanding of what her choice would mean for both of them. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable, broken only by the restless shifting of horses and the whisper of wind across the empty land. Then Takina raised her head, and when she spoke, her voice carried the clear authority of someone who had found her truth in the crucible of impossible choices. "I renounce my Apache blood," she said, each word falling like a stone into still water. "I renounce my Apache name, my Apache heritage, my Apache past. I choose to die to the people who cast me out and to live among those who showed me mercy when mercy was needed." Many horses nodded slowly, as if he had expected this answer but still found it worthy of respect. "Then it is done," he said with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "The woman who was once called Takina is dead. She died in the desert where we left her, and her bones have been scattered by the winds. We will never speak of her again, never acknowledge that she existed, never remember the sound of her voice or the shape of her face." He turned to address Elias directly, his weathered features grave but not hostile. "White man, you have chosen to shelter someone who no longer exists in our memory. What name will you give to this ghost you have made into flesh?" The question caught Elias off guard, forcing him to confront something he hadn't fully considered. If Takina was renouncing her Apache identity completely, then she would need a new name, a new identity, a new story to explain her presence in his life and his community. He looked at the woman beside him, seeing her in the growing darkness, as if for the first time. She had traded away everything she had been born to, her culture, her heritage, her very identity, for the chance to build something new. She had chosen him, chosen his world, chosen a future that existed only in possibility and hope. "Grace," he said suddenly, the name coming to him with the force of revelation. "Her name is Grace." Many horses considered this, then nodded approval. "Grace, it is a good name for one who has been given a second chance at life." He paused, studying both of them with eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. "But know this, white man, this woman's choice binds her to your world completely. She cannot return to ours, can never be Apache again, can never claim the protection of our laws or customs. She is yours now to protect or to abandon as you choose." "I understand," Elias replied, feeling the weight of that responsibility settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. "And I accept it." "Then it is finished." Many horses turned back to his warriors, speaking in rapid Apache that clearly conveyed orders for departure. As they mounted their horses and prepared to leave, he called back one final time. "The woman who was Takina is dead. The woman you call Grace never existed in our world. Remember this, all of you, when stories are told of what happened here." And with that, the Apache war party wheeled their horses and rode back toward the eastern ridge, disappearing into the gathering darkness as suddenly as they had appeared. Within minutes, even the sound of their horses' hooves had faded into the vast silence of the desert night. The white men who had come with Crawford watched them go with a mixture of relief and bewilderment, clearly struggling to process what they had just witnessed. The confrontation they had expected, violence, threats, demands for the woman's return, had instead become something far more complex and final. Crawford was the first to find his voice, though it came out strained and uncertain. "What the hell just happened here? Did they just abandon her? They declared her dead," Father Miguel said quietly, his voice filled with something approaching awe. "They performed what amounts to a spiritual execution, cutting her completely from their world as if she had never existed." "But why?" Jackson asked, clearly confused by the evening's events. If they wanted her dead, why not just kill her? Why go through all this ceremony? Grace Elias found himself already thinking of her by her new name, answered with a sad smile. Because killing me would have acknowledged that I still mattered to them. This way I simply stop existing. It is the most complete form of exile they could impose. Peters, the young cowboy who had first spotted the Apache riders, shook his head in amazement. So you're not Apache anymore, just like that. Just like that, Grace confirmed. I am dead to my people as completely as if my body lay in the ground. But I am alive to this world, free to become whatever I choose to be. The implications of her transformation seemed to sink in gradually for Crawford's group. If Grace was no longer Apache, if her own people had formally disowned her and declared her dead, then the threat they had feared, Apache retaliation for harboring one of their own, had been eliminated. She was now simply a woman without a past, starting over in a new world. But Crawford predictably wasn't ready to let go of his anger. This doesn't change anything, he said stubbornly. Apache or not, she's still a savage, still dangerous, still doesn't belong among civilized people. Bill, Father Miguel said with gentle but firm authority, the woman has just renounced everything she ever was for the chance to live peacefully among us. If that is not worthy of our compassion and acceptance, then what does that say about our own capacity for Christian charity? It says we're fools if we trust her, Crawford shot back. Leopards don't change their spots, Father. Apache blood is Apache blood, no matter what ceremonies you perform or what names you give. Grace stepped forward, her bearing proud despite everything she had just sacrificed. Mr. Crawford, she said with quiet dignity, you are right. That blood cannot be changed. But blood does not determine character, and character does not determine destiny. I have chosen to trust in the mercy of strangers rather than cling to the hatred of my own people. If you cannot find it in your heart to accept that choice, then that is your burden to carry, not mine. Her words, delivered with such calm authority, seemed to affect even Crawford's supporters. Jackson shifted uncomfortably in his saddle while Peters actually removed his hat, as if in the presence of someone deserving of respect. But Crawford himself remained unmoved. Pretty words, he said coldly. But when trouble comes, and it will come, don't expect the rest of us to die for your romantic notions about redemption and second chances. The only trouble I see here tonight, Elias said quietly, is a man who can't accept that sometimes people change, sometimes enemies become friends, and sometimes the greatest danger comes from those who preach hatred in the name of safety. The two men faced each other across the dusty yard, and for a moment the tension crackled between them like lightning before a storm. But before the confrontation could escalate, Father Miguel stepped between them with the calm authority of someone accustomed to mediating disputes. Gentlemen, he said firmly, enough. This woman has made her choice, and that choice has been witnessed by representatives of both peoples. The matter is settled. Crawford's face was dark with frustration, but he seemed to recognize that he had lost whatever support he might have had from his companions. With visible reluctance, he mounted his horse and gathered his reins. This isn't over, Ward, he said, his voice carrying the promise of future trouble. Mark my words, this decision will come back to haunt all of us. Maybe, Elias replied evenly, but at least it will be a decision made from compassion rather than fear. As Crawford and his men rode away into the darkness, their departure marked by the gradual fading of hoofbeats and the settling of dust, the yard of the ranch fell quiet once again. Father Miguel began loading his wagon with unhurried movements, clearly preparing to depart as well. Father, Grace said, approaching the elderly priest with obvious gratitude, thank you for speaking for me when you had no obligation to do so. Child, Father Miguel replied with a gentle smile. Speaking for those who cannot speak for themselves is not an obligation, it is a privilege. And tonight you spoke quite well for yourself. He turned to Elias, his weathered face serious in the lamplight that spilled from the cabin windows. My son, you have taken on a great responsibility. This woman has burned all her bridges to stand beside you. Do not make her regret that sacrifice." "I won't," Elias promised, meaning it with every fiber of his being. Father Miguel nodded, apparently satisfied with what he saw in Elias's expression. "Then may God bless you both, and may you find happiness in the life you are building together." As the priest's wagon disappeared into the night, leaving only the creak of wheels and the soft singing of Spanish hymns in its wake, Elias and Grace found themselves alone for the first time since the evening's dramatic events had begun. The silence between them felt different now, heavier with possibility, charged with the weight of irreversible choices. "Grace," Elias said softly, testing the name on his tongue. "Do you like it? The name, I mean?" She considered the question seriously, as she seemed to consider everything. "It means unmerited favor, does it not? Kindness shown to one who has not earned it. That's one definition." "Then it is perfect," she said with a small smile, "because grace is exactly what you have shown me from the moment you found me in the desert." They stood together in the gathering darkness, two people who had been alone for so long that the idea of shared companionship felt both foreign and wonderful. Around them, the familiar sounds of the ranch, settling into evening, the soft lowing of cattle, the rustle of chickens in their roost, the whisper of wind through the eaves of the cabin, seemed somehow different, more welcoming, as if the place itself had been transformed by the events of the day. "What happens now?" Grace asked quietly. "I am no longer who I was, but I do not yet know who I am becoming." Elias considered the question, thinking about the magnitude of the change she had undergone. In the space of a few hours, she had ceased to exist as an Apache woman and been reborn as someone entirely new. Her past had been erased as completely as words wiped from a slate, leaving only the present moment and the future they might build together. "Now we figure it out together," he said finally. "One day at a time, one choice at a time, until you become whoever that you want to be." "And what if who I want to be is someone who stays here, someone who builds a life on this ranch, in this place with you?" The question hung between them, heavy with implication and possibility. Because while neither of them had spoken directly of love, while their relationship remained undefined and uncertain, the events of the evening had forced them to confront the reality of what was growing between them. "Then that's what we'll do," Elias said simply. "If that's what you want, if that's what would make you happy, then that's what we will build." Grace was quiet for a long moment, looking out across the darkened landscape that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. When she spoke again, her voice was soft but certain. "I have never in my life made a choice purely for myself," she said. "Every decision I ever made was shaped by what was expected of me as a daughter, as a wife, as a member of my tribe. But tonight, for the first time, I chose based on what I wanted, what I needed, what felt right in my heart." "And what does your heart tell you?" She turned to face him fully, and in the lamplight spilling from the cabin windows, her eyes seemed to hold all the stars in the desert sky. "It tells me that I have found something rare and precious, something worth the sacrifice of everything I used to be. It tells me that I want to stay here with you and see what kind of life we can build together." The admission hung between them like a bridge across a chasm, an offer of connection that would change everything if accepted. Elias felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he realized that she was giving him the same choice she had just made, the opportunity to abandon his solitary grief and embrace the possibility of something new. "Grace," he said carefully, "you should know that if you stay here, if we try to build something together, it won't be easy. There will be people like Crawford who never accept you, never see you as anything but an enemy. There will be challenges we can't even imagine yet." "I know," she replied, "but I have learned that the things worth having are rarely easy to obtain or to keep, and I would rather face those challenges with someone I care about than face safety alone." The word care resonated between them, encompassing more than friendship but stopping short of declarations neither was quite ready to make. It was enough for now to acknowledge that whatever was growing between them was real, and worth protecting. "Then we'll face them together," Elias said, and as he spoke the words he felt something that had been frozen inside him for 5 years begin to thaw. "Whatever comes, we'll handle it together." Grace smiled, and for the first time since he had known her, the expression was completely unguarded, free of the careful caution that had marked all their previous interactions. It was the smile of someone who had finally found her way home after a long and difficult journey. "Together," she agreed. "I like the sound of that." Over the following days, the ranch underwent a subtle but profound transformation. Grace threw herself into the work of making the place not just livable, but truly alive again, attacking years of accumulated neglect with the same methodical determination she brought to everything. But more than that, she began to leave her own mark on the space, adding small touches that spoke of a woman's presence and care. She started with the kitchen, organizing supplies and equipment with an efficiency that made cooking a pleasure rather than a chore. Then she moved on to the other rooms, cleaning and arranging with an eye for both comfort and beauty. She mended curtains that had hung in tatters for years, polished furniture that had been hidden under layers of dust, and gradually restored the cabin to something that felt like a home rather than a monument to loss. But the most significant changes were less tangible. The silence that had characterized the ranch for 5 years gave way to the sounds of conversation, laughter, and shared purpose. Grace hummed while she worked, filling the empty spaces with melodies that seemed to chase away the ghosts that had haunted the place for so long. Elias found himself looking forward to meals for the first time since Martha's death, not just because Grace was an excellent cook, but because they had become opportunities for conversation and connection. They talked about everything: her memories of growing up Apache, his stories of life in Missouri before the move west, their shared observations about the land and the weather and the complex social dynamics of frontier life. But perhaps most importantly, they talked about the future. Not in grand, sweeping terms, but in the small, practical ways that people plan a life together. Which fields might be planted next spring, what improvements the cabin needed, how they might expand the ranch if the drought ever broke and the cattle market recovered. These conversations carried an intimacy that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with the profound trust required to plan a shared future. They were the talks of partners, of people who had decided to bind their fates together and were working out the practical details of how to make that binding successful. The physical distance between them remained carefully maintained, an acknowledgement that while they were growing closer emotionally, the proper form still needed to be observed. Grace slept in Sarah's room, took her meals across the table from Elias rather than beside him, and was careful never to be alone with him in circumstances that might invite gossip or speculation. But within those boundaries, their connection deepened daily. Elias found himself sharing memories he had kept locked away for years, talking about Martha and Sarah, not with the crushing grief that had characterized such conversations before, but with genuine fondness for the good times they had shared. Grace, in turn, began to speak of her life before exile, not as a lost paradise, but as preparation for something better. "I think," she said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the western mountains, "that everything I went through, the unhappy marriage, the tribal politics, even the beating and exile, was necessary to bring me here to this place, to you." "You don't think you could have found happiness within your own culture?" Elias asked. "If circumstances had been different, if you'd married a different man, or the tribal attitudes had been more accepting?" Grace was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness she brought to all their conversations. "Perhaps," she said finally, "but it would have been a different kind of happiness, built on conformity and acceptance rather than choice and growth. Here with you, I am free to become whoever I want to be. That freedom is worth more than comfort or security." Her words resonated with something deep in Elias's own experience, because while his path to this moment had been very different from hers, He too had discovered that sometimes the greatest growth came from the greatest losses, that sometimes you had to lose everything you thought you wanted in order to find what you actually needed. "I feel the same way," he admitted. "I thought my life was over when Martha and Sarah died. I thought the best I could hope for was to get through each day without falling apart completely. But now, Grace prompted gently, now I feel like I'm living again instead of just surviving, like there's a point to getting up in the morning beyond just the biological imperative to keep breathing." Their eyes met across the space between their chairs, and for a moment the careful distance they maintained seemed to collapse. The attraction that had been growing between them, never acknowledged but always present, suddenly filled the air between them like heat from a forge. But before either could act on the impulse, the sound of approaching horses once again shattered the evening quiet. This time, however, it was a single rider moving at an easy pace that suggested news rather than threat. The rider resolved into Sheriff Morrison, and Elias felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as he recognized the lawman's familiar figure. Morrison's expression was neutral as he dismounted, but there was something in his posture that suggested he was the bearer of significant news. "Evening, folks," Morrison said, touching his hat brim in greeting. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Just watching the sunset," Elias replied, rising from his chair. "What brings you out this way, Tom?" Morrison's gaze moved between Elias and Grace, taking in their relaxed postures and obvious comfort with each other. "Heard there was some excitement out here a few days ago. Apache visitors, according to the stories going around town." "Stories have a way of growing in the telling," Elias said carefully. "What have you heard? That a war party rode up to your ranch, had some kind of powwow with your guest, and then rode away again without anybody getting shot?" Morrison's tone was carefully neutral, but his eyes were sharp as he studied their faces. "True," Grace answered before Elias could respond. "It is true, Sheriff. Representatives of my former people came to determine my status. They concluded that I am no longer Apache, and departed satisfied with that resolution." "No longer Apache?" Morrison's eyebrows rose. "How does someone stop being Apache?" "By renouncing all claim to Apache identity and accepting cultural death in exchange for physical life." Grace replied with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing the weather. "I am dead to my people as completely as if my body lay in the ground, but I am alive to this world, free to make a new life among new people." Morrison absorbed this information slowly, clearly working through the implications. "So there's no chance of them coming back? No possibility of future diplomatic complications?" "None," Grace said firmly. "The woman who was Takina is dead. The woman who stands before you now has no ties to any Apache band or tribal authority." "And the name of this new woman?" "Grace," Elias said, speaking for the first time since the conversation had begun. "Her name is Grace." Morrison nodded slowly, apparently satisfied with their answers. "Well, that should put an end to most of the talk in town. Folks were worried about harboring a hostile, but if she's not Apache anymore, then the whole problem disappears." "Most of the talk," Elias caught the qualification. Morrison's expression grew more serious. "Bill Crawford's still making noise about the situation. He's convinced that this is all some kind of elaborate deception, that she's still Apache and still dangerous. He's been trying to organize support for more direct action." "What kind of direct action?" Grace asked quietly. "The kind that involves torches and ropes," Morrison replied bluntly. "The kind that doesn't wait for legal proceedings or worry much about evidence." The threat hung in the air between them, and Elias felt a familiar cold anger settle in his chest. "How much support is he getting?" "Less than he'd like, more than I'd prefer," Morrison admitted. "Most folks are willing to accept that the Apache have settled the matter themselves. But there are always those who think the only good Indian is a dead Indian, regardless of the circumstances." "And what's your position on the matter, Sheriff?" Grace asked with quiet dignity. Morrison studied her face in the lamplight, taking in her calm bearing and obvious intelligence. "My position is that you're a woman who's been through hell and found someone willing to give you a second chance at life. My position is that anyone who wants to interfere with that will have to go through me first." The simple declaration of support seemed to surprise Grace, who had clearly expected more skepticism from the representative of white law and order. "Thank you, Sheriff. Your words mean more than you know." "Just doing my job, ma'am. Keeping the peace includes protecting folks from lynch mobs regardless of their background." Morrison paused, then continued with obvious reluctance. "But I should warn you that I can't be everywhere at once. If Crawford decides to act, you'll need to be ready to defend yourselves." "We'll be ready," Elias said quietly, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle that was never far from his reach. Morrison nodded, apparently satisfied that they understood the gravity of the situation. "One more thing," he said as he prepared to remount his horse. "There's been talk about getting a preacher out here from Tucson, someone to perform a proper wedding ceremony for anyone who might be interested in making their arrangement official." The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge, and Elias felt his heart skip a beat as he realized what Morrison was really saying. Because while he and Grace had grown closer over the past weeks, while their partnership had deepened into something that felt like love, they hadn't discussed marriage or any kind of formal commitment. "That's something to consider," Elias said, carefully, acutely aware of Grace's eyes on him. Morrison smiled for the first time since his arrival. "I thought it might be. Preacher Wilson should be passing through in about 2 weeks. If anyone's interested in his services, they should let me know." As the sheriff rode away into the darkness, leaving only the soft echo of hoofbeats and the gradual settling of dust, Elias and Grace found themselves alone once again with a new question hanging between them. "Marriage," Grace said softly, testing the word as if it were foreign to her. "Marriage." Elias agreed, his heart hammering against his ribs as he contemplated the magnitude of what Morrison had suggested. Because while their relationship had been growing deeper and stronger every day, while they had begun to plan a future together, the idea of formal marriage carried implications that went far beyond practical partnership. It meant declaring to the world that they were bound together not just by circumstance or convenience, but by choice and love. It meant that Grace would become not just his companion, but his wife, with all the legal protections and social recognition that status carried. It meant that she would have a place in the community, not as a refugee or a curiosity, but as a respectable married woman. But it also meant taking a step that could never be undone, binding their lives together in a way that would last until death separated them. "Is that what you want?" Grace asked quietly. "To make our arrangement official?" Elias looked at her in the lamplight, seeing not just the beautiful woman who had transformed his home and his life, but the partner who had chosen to sacrifice everything for the chance to build something new with him. "Yes," he said simply, "if you'll have me." Grace's smile was radiant as sunrise. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll have you." And as they stood together on the porch of the ranch that had become their shared home, surrounded by the vast emptiness of the desert night, Elias Ward and the woman who had once been Takina, but was now Grace, began to plan not just their wedding, but the life they would build together in the face of whatever challenges the future might bring. The 2 weeks that followed Sheriff Morrison's visit passed with the kind of charged anticipation that made every ordinary moment feel significant. Grace threw herself into preparing for their wedding with the same methodical determination she brought to everything, but there was a joy in her movements now that had been absent during her recovery. She mended her best dress with careful stitches, adding delicate embroidery that transformed the simple garment into something worthy of the most important day of her new life. Elias found himself paying attention to details that had escaped his notice for years. The way morning light fell across the kitchen table where they would share breakfast as husband and wife. The sound of Grace's laughter echoing through rooms that had been silent for too long. The gradual transformation of his solitary existence into something richer and more meaningful than he had dared to hope for. But beneath the anticipation ran an undercurrent of tension that neither of them could entirely ignore. Crawford's threats hadn't materialized into action yet, but the knowledge that opposition existed somewhere in the darkness beyond their ranch cast a shadow over even their happiest moments. They found themselves listening more carefully to approaching hoofbeats, watching the horizons more intently, and never straying far from the weapons that had become constant companions. The first sign that their peaceful interlude was coming to an end arrived on a Tuesday morning in the form of Miguel Santos, riding hard and looking over his shoulder as if he expected pursuit. His usually calm demeanor was replaced by obvious agitation, and sweat stained his shirt despite the cool morning air. "Elias, mi amigo," he called out as he approached the cabin, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to talk, and quickly." "What's wrong, Miguel?" Elias emerged from the barn where he had been checking on a lame horse, Grace close behind him. Both of them could read the worry written across their neighbor's weathered features. Miguel dismounted quickly, his eyes constantly scanning the surrounding landscape. "Crawford has been busy, my friend, very busy. He has been riding from ranch to ranch, talking to anyone who will listen, spreading stories about the danger you have brought to our community." "What kind of stories?" Grace asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. "He tells people that the Apache who came here were not negotiating but planning, that they were scouting our defenses, counting our numbers, preparing for a great raid that will sweep across the territory like fire." Miguel's voice carried the disgust of a man forced to repeat lies he found offensive. "He says that Grace is their spy, their inside agent, gathering information to help them plan their attack." Elias felt his jaw clench with anger at the sheer audacity of Crawford's accusations. "That's completely false, and anyone with half a brain should be able to see it. See, but fear makes men stupid, and Crawford knows how to feed fear until it grows fat and hungry." Miguel's expression was grim. "He has convinced perhaps a dozen men to ride with him, maybe more. They speak of cleansing the territory of the Apache threat before it can spread." "When?" Grace asked quietly, her voice steady despite the color draining from her face. "Tonight, I think. Maybe tomorrow." Crawford wanted to move immediately, but some of the others insisted on gathering more men first, on making sure they had enough firepower to handle any resistance. Miguel looked directly at Grace, his eyes filled with genuine sympathy. "I am sorry, Senora. You seem like a good woman caught in the hatred of small men." "Thank you for the warning," Grace replied with dignity that impressed both men. "It was dangerous for you to come here." Miguel shrugged with the fatalism of someone who had lived through enough conflicts to understand the price of neutrality. A man must be able to look at himself in the mirror, know I could not stand by, and watch innocent people be murdered by a mob. "What about Sheriff Morrison?" Elias asked. "Does he know what Crawford is planning?" "He suspects, but Crawford has been careful to make his preparations look like legitimate community defense. The sheriff cannot arrest men for organizing to protect their families, even if their real purpose is something darker." Miguel remounted his horse, clearly anxious to be away before his visit was discovered. "Morrison said to tell you that he will do what he can, but his hands are tied until Crawford actually breaks the law." "By then it might be too late," Elias observed grimly. "See, that is what I fear also." Miguel gathered his reins, preparing to depart. "I must go before I am seen here." "But Elias, my friend, have you considered that perhaps it would be better for the Senora to leave just for a little while until the anger cools and men remember how to think with their heads instead of their fears?" It was the same suggestion Father Miguel had made weeks earlier, the offer of sanctuary that would keep Grace safe, but separate them just when their future together was beginning to take shape. Elias felt the familiar weight of an impossible choice, her safety against their happiness, prudence against love. "I won't run," Grace said before Elias could respond, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had marked her confrontation with the Apache war chief. "I have done nothing wrong, and I will not be driven away by men who hate me for what I used to be, rather than who I have chosen to become." Miguel studied her face in the morning light, and something in his expression shifted to show a respect that bordered on admiration. "Then may God protect you both, because you will need all the help you can get." After Miguel's departure, the ranch settled into an uneasy quiet that felt more ominous than peaceful. Grace continued her daily routine with stubborn determination, but Elias could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes continually scanned the horizon for signs of approaching trouble. He found himself checking and rechecking his weapons positioning ammunition where it could be quickly accessed, and planning defensive strategies for scenarios he hoped would never come to pass. As afternoon faded toward evening, they found themselves on the porch again, drawn by the illusion of normalcy that their shared vigil provided. But tonight the familiar ritual felt different, charged with the knowledge that it might be their last peaceful evening together. "Are you afraid?" Elias asked quietly, breaking the contemplative silence that had stretched between them. Grace considered the question with her usual thoughtfulness. "Yes," she said finally, "but not of dying. I have already died once when I renounced my Apache identity. Death holds fewer terrors for someone who has already experienced it. Then what frightens you? That we might not have the chance to see what our life together could become, that these men's hatred might destroy something beautiful before it has the opportunity to fully bloom." She turned to look at him directly, her eyes reflecting the last light of the setting sun. "I am afraid that love might not be stronger than fear, despite what the poets tell us." Her words hit him with unexpected force, not just because of their content, but because it was the first time either of them had used the word love to describe what was growing between them. It hung in the air now, acknowledged and real, adding weight to everything they were fighting to protect. "Love is stronger," Elias said with quiet conviction. "It has to be, because if it isn't, then nothing we've done here matters, and I can't accept that." Grace smiled, and even in the gathering darkness, the expression transformed her face with radiant beauty. "Then we will fight for it, together. Whatever comes, we will stand together and prove that love is indeed stronger than hate." Their conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of multiple horses approaching from the direction of town, not the casual pace of a single visitor, but the purposeful advance of a group moving with military precision. Both of them tensed hands, moving instinctively toward the weapons that had become constant companions. "How many?" Grace asked, her voice steady despite the obvious tension. Elias counted the overlapping rhythms of hoofbeats, his experienced ear picking out individual horses from the collective sound. 8, maybe 10, moving fast but not charging. They want to arrive with enough light to see what they're doing. Grace nodded, understanding the tactical implications. Crawford's group was timing their arrival to have sufficient daylight for their confrontation while maintaining the psychological advantage of superior numbers and coordinated movement. "What do we do?" she asked. "We make them understand that this isn't going to be as easy as they think." Elias replied, rising from Rafa's chair and reaching for the rifle that leaned against the porch railing. "And we hope that when they see we're prepared to fight, they'll reconsider whether their cause is worth dying for." The riders came into view as the sun touched the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed almost too beautiful for such an ugly confrontation. Crawford led the group, his face set in lines of righteous determination, flanked by men Elias recognized from town shopkeepers and ranchers and drifters who had found common cause in their fear and hatred. But as they drew closer, Elias noticed something that gave him a flicker of hope. The group was smaller than Miguel had suggested, only 7 men instead of the dozen or more that Crawford had apparently hoped to recruit. And some of those who had come looked uncertain, as if they were beginning to question the wisdom of their mission. The riders pulled up in a loose semicircle about 30 yards from the cabin, close enough for easy conversation, but far enough away to avoid any immediate threat. Crawford dismounted with theatrical flair, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol as he faced the porch where Elias and Grace stood waiting. "Ward," Crawford called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "We've come to settle this matter once and for all." "What matter is that Bill," Elias replied evenly, his rifle held casually but ready for instant use. "Near as I can tell, the only matter that needs settling is your inability to mind your own business." Crawford's face flushed with anger at the casual dismissal, but he maintained his composure with visible effort. "The matter of the Apache spy you've been harboring, the matter of the threat you've brought to this entire community." "There's no Apache here," Grace said, stepping forward to stand beside Elias with calm dignity. "The Apache woman you speak of is dead, declared so by her own people. I am Grace Ward, and I will be legally married to this man within the week." The claim of impending marriage clearly caught Crawford off guard, and Elias could see several of his companions exchanging uncertain glances. Because while they might be willing to participate in violence against an Apache woman, attacking a white man's intended bride was a very different matter with very different legal and social consequences. "Marriage doesn't change what you are," Crawford said, but with less conviction than before. "Apache blood is Apache blood, no matter what ceremonies you perform or what names you take. And ignorant hatred is ignorant hatred, no matter how you dress it up into talk of community safety," Elias replied. "This woman has done nothing to threaten you or anyone else. She's been living peacefully on my ranch, harming no one, helping me rebuild a life that was falling apart." One of Crawford's companions, a middle-aged rancher named Thompson, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Bill, if they're planning to get married, I mean, that changes things, doesn't it? She'd be a white man's wife, legally speaking." "It doesn't change anything." Crawford snapped, his frustration evident as he saw his support beginning to waver. "She's still Apache, still a threat, still doesn't belong among civilized people." "What threat?" Grace asked with quiet challenge. "Specifically, Mr. Crawford, what threat do I pose to you or your family or your property? What have I done? What have I said? What evidence do you have that I am anything other than a woman trying to build a peaceful life?" The direct question seemed to catch Crawford off guard, forcing him to confront the fact that his accusations were based entirely on assumption and prejudice, rather than any actual evidence of wrongdoing. "You're Apache," he said, as if that fact alone constituted sufficient proof of guilt. "I was Apache," Grace corrected gently. "Now I am simply a woman who has found love and acceptance among people who were willing to see past old hatreds to recognize shared humanity." Her words carried a quiet dignity that seemed to affect even some of Crawford's supporters, because standing there in the fading light, dressed in a simple cotton dress and speaking with calm eloquence about love and acceptance, she looked nothing like the savage warrior they had been expecting to confront. "This is all very touching," Crawford said with bitter sarcasm. "But it doesn't change the fact that she's a security risk. What happens when other Apache discover she's here when they see that we're protecting one of their own?" "They won't discover it," Grace replied with quiet certainty, "because to them I no longer exist. I am as dead to my former people as your grandfather is to you. They have no more interest in me than they do in any other ghost. You can't know that for certain. I can know it with absolute certainty because I was there when the judgment was pronounced. I heard the words that cut me from my people as completely as a knife cuts a rope. I felt the finality of their decision, the completeness of my exile." Grace's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the surface. "You fear a threat that does not exist, Mr. Crawford. The only danger here comes from your own hatred." Thompson spoke up again, his voice uncertain. "Bill, maybe we should reconsider this. If the Apache have already written her off, if she's really going to marry Ward and become a respectable member of the community. "There's nothing respectable about marrying a savage," Crawford exploded, his careful composure finally cracking under the pressure of seeing his support erode. "And there's nothing safe about harboring one regardless of what ceremonies they perform." "That's enough, Bill." The new voice came from the edge of the group where Sheriff Morrison had appeared, with the silent efficiency of a man skilled in approaching dangerous situations undetected. His badge caught the last light of the setting sun as he rode forward, his presence immediately changing the dynamics of the confrontation. "Tom," Crawford said, trying to recover his composure, "this isn't official business. This is community members taking action to protect themselves." "Community members threatening violence against law-abiding citizens is definitely official business," Morrison replied evenly, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "And from what I've been hearing, that's exactly what this is." "The woman is Apache," Crawford insisted. "She's a threat to everyone in this territory. The woman is a legal resident who has committed no crimes and threatens no one," Morrison corrected firmly. "And if you take any action against her or Mr. Ward, you'll be dealing with me personally." The sheriff's intervention seemed to be the final straw for Crawford's already wavering support. Thompson and two other men began edging their horses away from the group, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the confrontation was taking. Violence against defenseless people was one thing when justified by community hysteria, but quite another when it meant defying the law and risking arrest. But Crawford himself seemed beyond reason, now driven by a rage that had grown far beyond any rational response to perceived threat. "You're all fools," he snarled, his hand moving toward his weapon. "When the Apache come, when they burn your homes and kill your families, remember that you could have prevented it here tonight. Bill, don't." Morrison's voice carried the flat authority of a man prepared to use deadly force if necessary. "Whatever you're thinking of doing, don't do it. Walk away now, and we can all pretend this never happened." For a moment, the tableau held frozen in the gathering dusk. Crawford with his hand hovering near his gun, Morrison ready to draw the remaining members of Crawford's group, clearly torn between loyalty and self-preservation. Elias felt his finger tighten on his rifle trigger, knowing that if violence erupted, the next few seconds would determine whether he and Grace lived to see their wedding day. The moment stretched until it became almost unbearable tension crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. Then Thompson spoke up, his voice cutting through the silence with unexpected authority. "That's it, Bill. I'm done." He wheeled his horse around and began riding away, calling back over his shoulder, "The rest of you can do what you want, but I won't be part of a lynching." His departure seemed to break the spell that had held the group transfixed. Two more men followed his example, spurring their horses toward town without looking back. Within moments, Crawford found himself with only 3 supporters, and even they looked uncertain about their commitment to his cause. "You're making a mistake," Crawford said, but the words lacked conviction now, the hollow ring of a man who knew his moment had passed. "The only mistake I see," Morrison replied calmly, "is yours. You've let hatred poison your judgment until you can't tell the difference between real threats and imaginary ones." Crawford's remaining supporters were already backing their horses away, clearly unwilling to face down the sheriff and 2 armed defenders for a cause that no longer seemed worth the risk. Left essentially alone, Crawford's bluster finally collapsed entirely. "This isn't over," he said, but his voice held defeat rather than determination. "People will remember what happened here, and they'll judge you all accordingly." "Let them judge," Grace said quietly, speaking for the first time since Morrison's arrival. "I would rather be judged for showing mercy than for displaying hatred. I would rather be remembered for choosing love over fear." Crawford stared at her for a long moment, his face working with emotions he couldn't quite express. Then he remounted his horse with jerky, angry movements and rode away into the gathering darkness, leaving only the echo of hoofbeats and the settling of dust to mark his departure. As silence returned to the ranch, Morrison dismounted and approached the porch with the casual movements of a man whose work was finished. "Well," he said with obvious satisfaction, "that went better than I expected." "How did you know to come?" Elias asked, lowering his rifle but keeping it ready. "Miguel Santos rode into town about an hour after he left here, told me Crawford was organizing his little expedition, and asked if I planned to do anything about it." Morrison's smile was grim but genuine. "Figured I'd better make an appearance before things got out of hand." "Thank you," Grace said simply. "Your timing was perfect." Morrison studied her face in the lamplight, taking in her calm dignity and obvious intelligence. "Ma'am, I've got to say you handled that situation with more grace than most folks would have managed. Crawford's not wrong about everything. There are people who will never accept you, never see you as anything but an enemy, but you've got friends too, people who believe in giving others a second chance." "That's all anyone can ask for," Grace replied, "a chance to prove themselves worthy of trust." Morrison nodded, apparently satisfied with her answer. "Speaking of which, Preacher Wilson rode into town this afternoon. He'll be available for wedding ceremonies starting tomorrow if anyone's interested." The reminder of their impending marriage brought a smile to Grace's face that transformed her features with radiant joy. "We're interested," she said, looking at Elias with eyes that held all the promise of their shared future. "Then I'll let him know to expect you," Morrison said, remounting his horse. "And folks in town will know to expect a new Mrs. Ward by week's end." As the sheriff rode away into the star-filled night, Elias and Grace found themselves alone once again, but this time the silence between them felt different, not heavy with pending threat, but light, with possibility and hope. "It's really happening," Grace said softly, as if speaking the words aloud would make them more real. "We're really going to be married." "Are you ready?" Elias asked, though he was really asking himself the same question, because while he had lived with grief for 5 years, he was still learning how to live with love. "I'm ready," Grace replied with quiet certainty. "For the first time in my life, I'm making a choice purely for love, purely for happiness, purely for the hope of building something beautiful with someone I care about more than my own safety." "Then let's do it," Elias said, feeling a lightness in his chest that he hadn't experienced since before Martha's death. "Let's get married and build that life together, whatever obstacles we have to overcome." Grace moved closer to him on the porch, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used, close enough to see the stars reflected in her dark eyes. "Elias Ward," she said softly, "you saved my life in that desert. But more than that, you gave me a reason to want to live. And you," he replied, reaching out to take her hand for the first time since that night, weeks ago when he had helped her from his horse, "gave me back my own life when I thought it was lost forever." They stood together in the desert night, two people who had found each other across every imaginable barrier of culture and circumstance and hatred, ready to bind their lives together in the face of whatever challenges the future might bring. The next morning dawned clear and bright with the kind of crystalline air that made the distant mountains look close enough to touch. Grace woke before sunrise, her heart hammering with anticipation and nervousness as she prepared for the most important day of her new life. She had been awake for hours, lying in Sarah's small bed and listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch awakening around her, but today those sounds seemed different, fuller, with promise, richer, with meaning. She dressed carefully in the simple blue dress she had spent weeks preparing, the one Martha had worn to church services in the early days of the ranch. Grace had altered it to fit her smaller frame and added delicate embroidery around the collar and cuffs, transforming it into something that honored both the woman who had worn it before and the woman who would wear it to her wedding. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Elias already dressed in his best clothes, the black suit he had worn to Martha's funeral but hadn't touched since. He had trimmed his beard and combed his hair with unusual care, and the result was a man who looked years younger than he had when she first arrived. "You look beautiful," he said softly, his eyes taking in every detail of her appearance with obvious appreciation. "And you look handsome," she replied, straightening his tie with gentle fingers. "Are you ready to become a married man again?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words, acknowledging the complexity of what he was doing, not just marrying her, but opening his heart to love again after years of protecting it with grief and solitude. "I'm ready," he said, and she could hear the truth of it in his voice. "More ready than I've been for anything in years." The ride into town was a quiet one, both of them lost in their own thoughts about the magnitude of the step they were taking. But as they crested the hill that overlooked the small settlement, Grace felt a surge of nervous excitement that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the joy of new beginnings. Word of their wedding had clearly spread through the community because a small crowd had gathered outside the church where Preacher Wilson was holding court. Some faces showed genuine warmth and acceptance, others displayed curiosity or uncertainty, and a few reflected the kind of disapproval that Grace had learned to expect from those who would never see past her Apache heritage. But as they dismounted in front of the church and walked together toward the simple wooden building, Grace realized that for the first time since her exile, she didn't care what the doubters thought. She had found love and acceptance with the man beside her, and that was enough to face whatever challenges the world might offer. Father Miguel was waiting inside the church, having made the journey from his own parish to witness the ceremony. His presence was both surprising and deeply moving, a sign that their union had support from unexpected quarters. "My children," he said with obvious joy, "you honor me by allowing me to share this day with you." Preacher Wilson proved to be a kindly man in his 60s with gentle eyes and a manner that suggested he had performed enough wedding ceremonies to understand that love came in many forms and rarely followed conventional paths. "Mr. Ward, Miss Grace," he said warmly, "are you ready to bind your lives together before God and these witnesses?" "We are," Elias replied, his voice steady and certain. The ceremony itself was simple but profound, filled with words about love and commitment and the promise to stand together through whatever trials life might bring. Grace found herself thinking about how different this was from her first wedding conducted according to Apache tradition, with elaborate ceremony and community celebration, but without the deep emotional connection that made this moment so meaningful. When Preacher Wilson asked if she would take Elias as her husband, to love and honor him for as long as they both lived, Grace's answer came from the deepest part of her heart. "I will," she said, looking into Elias's eyes and seeing her own joy reflected there. "With all my heart, I will." And when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, when Elias leaned down to kiss her gently, while the small congregation applauded, Grace felt as if she was being born for the second time, not into the world she had inherited, but into the one she had chosen to create. As they emerged from the church into the bright morning sunlight, now legally and formally bound together as man and wife, Grace caught sight of a familiar figure standing at the edge of the crowd. Miguel Santos had come to witness their wedding, his weathered face creased with genuine happiness for their union. "Congratulations, my friends," he said warmly, embracing them both. "May your marriage be blessed with many years of happiness." "Thank you for everything you've done for us," Grace said sincerely. "Your warning saved our lives, and your friendship means more than you know." Miguel's smile was tinged with sadness as he looked around at the mixed reactions of the townspeople. "Love should be celebrated, not feared. You two have found something rare and precious. Do not let small minds diminish its value." As they prepared to return to the ranch that would now be their shared home in every sense, Grace realized that the long journey that had begun with her exile from the Apache tribe was finally complete. She had lost everything she thought defined her, her culture, her people, her identity, only to discover that what she had gained was far more valuable. She had found love with a man who valued her for who she chose to be rather than what she had been born to. She had found acceptance from people willing to look past old prejudices to recognize shared humanity. And most importantly, she had found herself not the woman her tribe had expected her to be, but the woman she had always had the potential to become. The sun was directly overhead as they rode back toward the ranch, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and copper that seemed to promise prosperity and peace. Behind them, the town gradually disappeared into heat, shimmer, and distance, while ahead lay the home they would build, together the life they would share and the future that would belong entirely to them. "Mrs. Ward," Elias said softly, testing her new name on his tongue. "Yes, Mr. Ward," Grace replied with a smile that could have lit up the darkness. "I love you," he said simply, the words carrying all the weight of everything they had overcome to reach this moment. "And I love you," she replied, feeling the truth of it fill her heart with warmth that had nothing to do with the desert sun. "Today and always, I love you." As they crested the final hill before home, Grace looked out across the land that would now be hers as much as his, the endless vista of desert and mountain that stretched toward every horizon, harsh and beautiful and full of possibility. Somewhere in that vast emptiness, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, promising the rain that the land needed to bloom again. And like the desert waiting for rain, their love had waited through drought and hardship for this moment of renewal. Now, finally, the rains were coming, and everything would be green again.